Welcome back to the Late Stage Podcast, and I am your host, Sinan Schwarting, live from New York City. Co-hosting today, Pamuk. Okay, no, he's not. Take it back. It's great to be back. Episode 2. Not exactly a giant feat, of course, but we're being consistent, coming in with a weekly podcast. Thrilled to be back. We have a fantastic episode this week. We've got guests all across the board talking about various subjects. First of all, this week, I need to start with a couple corrections. Last week, I mentioned my daughter goes to private school and then talked about something with public school. My daughter goes to public school, and that's why I can say that in public schools, they are not teaching critical race theory. My daughter goes there, and like I said, I had to teach her about some of the negative aspects of Christopher Columbus and things of that nature. So, that's a correction. Additionally, I cut off a bit when I was talking about my sort of ethos and my mission statement for the podcast. I talked about financial inequities, and I cut out, for some reason, a bit at the end about racial inequity, how I thought racism was one of the main crises of our times. And, homophobia, all the phobias, any phobia against another human being, is something that we're here on the Late Stage Podcast very opposed to. I think I can speak for all my guests as well. But so, just a couple corrections. I guess let me dive into the table of contents. So we're going to be talking about Africa first. We've got news coming out of South Africa of the death of an elder statesman. With a little asterisk on that. We are going to talk about Nigeria and sort of scary case of a lack of transparency regarding the #EndSARS movement, which culminated in some, we'll talk about it when we get there, some bad news, we can say. Of course, then we're going to be talking about Asia, and I'm going to focus on the real estate crisis that's happening in China right now, just to sort of talk about the implications of it, what we might expect from it, even those of us who are not living in China, but how big of a crisis it is locally there and globally. And then we're going to talk about Saudi Arabia and something they're doing that's affecting the United States, and what's going to be in our top 5 kind of corporate media talking points this week is inflation in the United States. And Saudi Arabia is doing something, we could say, interesting as far as impacting prices of things here in the United States and around the world. I'm going to use that to segue into the United States, since that's sort of a half Asia, half US topic anyhow. And that's going to be where I have my first guest of the podcast. I have Matthew Miranda of the Jacobin Sports podcast, of Posting and Toasting, the Strickland, lots of great outlets, and many more, which you should definitely just check him out regarding. And I'll give you all of his info, where you can find him on Twitter. I'm having him on to talk about the latest kind of controversy out of the sports world that's impacting things in a political sense. And that is a number of celebrity athletes coming out against the vaccine, kind of. And it shouldn't overshadow the vast majority of them becoming vaccinated and playing without any hitches. But there are a few celebrities, vis-a-vis Aaron Rodgers and Kyrie Irving, who have sort of brought attention to the Anti-Vax movement. That's going to be sort of an important talking point. I have him on to talk about the dynamics of, the differences between the two cases and how they're being reacted to in the public and in the media and all that. It's a fascinating conversation. I have not edited it yet, and I do not know how I'm going to cut it down to fit this episode, but I'll figure it out. I think I will include the full episode Somehow I'm sort of, maybe I'll set up a Patreon thing so that I can have a place where people can go to hear extended cuts like that. I promise, make it very affordable. Anyway. Then we're going to move on to South America and Central America, and even, I suppose you could even say, North America, the Spanish-speaking parts of the Americas. And we're going to first of all talk about Argentina, and Sergio Aguero, kind of continuing in the vein of sports. But this is one that is, I think, probably of significant importance to not only Argentina, but football, soccer fans around the world. So, of course, that will be a major news item, potentially. And then we're going to move to Mexico, which is technically still in North America, but we're going to roll with it. And we're going to talk about art and culture and some exciting art news regarding Frida Kahlo. Shouts to my daughter. My daughter loves Frida Kahlo, her favorite artist. So this is for her, I suppose, a news item for her. And then finally, we're going to go into Europe. I'm going to talk very briefly about some news out of Belarus and Poland, which I hope to expand on with another guest in the next episode. But certainly, what we're really here for regarding Europe is going to be talk about German elections. I think in the sort of EU world of late, Germany has sort of taken a position of prominence politically in Europe, and following their elections and the sort of tides of left, right, how people are reacting to COVID and all that could, I think, be quite important and relevant for us to understand and know about outside of Germany. My guest will be Yasin Privat 2000. Right there, you can see it. That's his Twitter name. Or just Yasin is what we'll call him. He'll be our sort of German correspondent potentially going forward if he's interested in the gig. But yeah, he talked about the elections. And yeah, very informative stuff. It kind of explains the parties there and the sort of context for the elections in this last cycle. So yeah, it should be very informative. And then I'll wrap it up with my usual segments. I'm going to talk about the power rankings for corporate media talking points. And I'm going to skip any sort of music recommendations this episode, just because I gave you 3 last one, and there's plenty there for you to explore. But perhaps I'll get back to that soon. Anyhow, without further ado, let's dive in to the news. So news out of South Africa in this last week broke of a death. Frederick Willem DeKlerk, the last president of apartheid South Africa from 1989 to 1994, passed away. He is a figure of controversy. He was a Nobel laureate, but notoriously didn't get along with Nelson Mandela. They were very mistrustful of each other. People have often argued that, kind of what you often hear about, like Abraham Lincoln, that he wasn't necessarily a big fan of ending apartheid, but it was sort of politically advantageous. Supposedly there was pressure from Margaret Thatcher, of all people. But so, yeah, he passed away. I mean, adding to the controversy was that he notoriously kind of only gave really a qualified apology for apartheid. So, people felt like it wasn't very contrite. And on top of that, he never came out against human rights abuses by the state security forces. So, he supposedly was also very disliked by the far right in South Africa, as you can imagine, being associated with the end of apartheid. But yeah, he's passed away. Bye, dude, I suppose. And so, yeah, that's it out of South Africa. Moving to Nigeria with slightly worse news, I suppose we could all agree. Many will recall in Nigeria that in about 2017, a big movement sort of spread out across the internet called #EndSARS. It was a movement that got a lot of heat because celebrities from especially the hip hop world sort of glommed onto it. Especially, I'm thinking of like MCs like Chica and No Name, more politically active hip hop artists came out and brought attention to the issue. And what this was a movement against police violence in Nigeria. In particular, young people felt like they were being targeted by the police, kind of corrupt police force, if you will, and that they were using social media like as a way to, because they were being met with force by police in protesting on the streets. They brought a lot of that energy to the social media realm and brought a lot of celebrities to their cause by doing so. But it kind of left our psyche, I suppose, and it left the public eye, and many don't know how it ended up being resolved. In that regard, some bad news came out of Nigeria in this last week. Apparently, it was leaked. There was a leaked report by an inquiry panel which found that Nigerian armed forces murdered #EndSARS protesters in 2020. Supposedly in October 2020, by the Lekki toll gate in Nigeria. It's now been basically proven that protesters were murdered by Nigerian armed forces. The army has, from that time, denied having done so, and so this comes out as quite the controversy in Nigeria, as you can imagine, an example of sort of endemic corruption in the armed forces, and it probably kind of underlines what people were protesting at the time and why they were protesting. So again, good luck to the people of Nigeria who are involved in that movement, and solidarity. Moving on, we're here to talk a little bit now about Asia. First of all, big news, and I don't typically talk about economic news. That's not the type of news that gets a lot of people's interest, but this is a big news item in that it could truly impact the world. Anyone with a remote interest or knowledge in economics, or even politics, I suppose, will remember the subprime mortgage crisis. From 2007 to 2010, basically highly deregulated banks and financial service entities took advantage of a boost in mortgage credit by basically just dishing out homes to anybody who had a remote interest. And what ended up happening was a number of people defaulting, not being able to pay their mortgages as they started catching up to them, essentially to their finances. And it resulted in a giant economic crisis that lasted at least 3 years, and the lasting impact has been ongoing, right? A number of laws and regulations have been put into effect because of what occurred there. I mention this because in China right now, something similar looks to be happening on the horizon. A real estate crisis has led to what people are calling a quote-unquote liquidity squeeze. And since about late 2019, this has been a bigger and bigger news item. Essentially, Evergrande, which is a huge real estate magnate in China, has been sort of threatening, and not threatening, but sort of hinting that they're potentially defaulting on about $300 billion in debt, which has loomed over them and the Chinese economy ever since, basically. What has been happening in China is a similar sort of housing boom where people are just buying and building property and building homes on top of it. And what it's led to is about 30 million homes in China now unoccupied because they've overbuilt, and 100 million homes that were purchased but remain unoccupied. So just giant swaths, like entire kind of ghost towns where real estate has pumped money in and not been able to sell anything afterwards. So these giant investments are kind of not being, no returns are coming in on that, and an entire industry seems to be on the brink of going under. Now, the most recent news in this last week is a company named Kaisa, Kaisa, another giant real estate firm in China, threatening to go under as well, or more specifically, they've been suspended from trading after announcing unprecedented pressure on the company's finances. So things are looking bleak in China economically in regards to the real estate industry. Why this matters? Now, the subprime mortgage crisis, when it hit, it hit the whole world, and it impacted it. Like I said, it continues to impact it to this day. One would argue that China's economy doesn't quite have the sort of global reach that the United States' economy does, so therefore it shouldn't have the same impact if their real estate industry goes down or gets really seriously hurt. On the flip side, apparently, supposedly 30% of China's economy is sort of mixed in with real estate, if not just fully the real estate industry, which means that the impact on the Chinese economy would be potentially far larger than the impact that the subprime mortgage crisis had on the United States economy, and then in turn the global economy. So whether that balances it out and means that this could have the same impact as the subprime mortgage crisis did globally remains to be seen, but it's something that one should be weary of. Apparently, this is an actual crisis, and one of the scope that it could be worth knowing about, even if you're not big on economics or whatever it is that one would have to be. And additionally, while we're talking about Asian economics, Japanese export growth continues to slide, which is shocking news to me because I've been trying to get a PS5 for my nephew for I don't know how many months. So it strikes me that they should do better at getting their products out. It took me a long time to get a Nintendo Switch for my daughter as well. So, I don't know what the correlation there is necessarily, but anyway, they're struggling. Now, let's keep things moving. We'll move into Saudi Arabia. We'll use this as a sort of half Asia, half US story to segue from Asia to the United States. We're talking about Saudi Arabia and some sort of wild news. The Intercept just published an article, and it was by Ryan Grimm and Ken Klippenstein, two kind of stalwarts of the sort of Twitter left community. And the article was sort of illuminating in that it reveals that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, in his desire to help a more pro-Saudi regime in the United States, has decided to undercut the current president of the United States, Joe Biden, in his efforts to support a more Trumpian, one would imagine, candidate, given the tight relations between Trump and the Crown Prince, especially regarding Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist that was murdered, and the fact that it was sort of brushed under the carpet. So anyhow, what the Crown Prince has done is, in his attempts to help impact the world in a way that would hurt Joe Biden, he has decided to play with supply of oil, of crude, and in doing so has had the price of crude rise so much that it's quite considerably impacted inflation. And according to the article, it is perhaps the driver of that inflation right now. And so I'll talk later about how the corporate media in the United States has really focused on inflation this last week. But there's not been much talk of Saudi Arabia's role in that and the price of oil specifically. And so apparently that is a kind of calculated move by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to hurt Joe Biden and potentially help Trump regain power in the United States and thus help himself. Don't Khashoggi me, man. I'm not trying to mess with the crown prince here, but this is just the news, just reporting what I'm reading. Anyway, while on the topic of the United States, because this is sort of, again, it was a half Asia, half North America story there. Let's move on, of course, to my main topic of this episode. And so, COVID. Dun, dun, dun. It's back in the news in Europe, where the numbers are rising again. It's left the news here in the United States for the most part, as all this other crazy news has hit the press. Tons of crazy trials. Again, I'll talk about in the sort of power rankings of the corporate media here. But what we can definitively say is that the real story that's been in the news regarding coronavirus or the COVID pandemic lately has been certain characters in the sports world, athletes, weighing in on the vaccine rather. And Kyrie Irving a few months ago was the first to do so. Kyrie Irving, a very famous basketball player who has taken a number of controversial political stances, some that leave you scratching your head, others that are fairly inspiring. He supported Tahani Abuji for district attorney here in New York City, which would have been fantastic had he been voted in. Unfortunately, he lost. But so his latest stance has been to not get vaccinated and therefore not play this season. Importantly, it's not a rule by the NBA. The city of New York, specifically in the state, have mandates about vaccines in public spaces, in public gatherings. And so his not being vaccinated would have disallowed him being present in the Barclays Center, which is the Nets stadium or arena. So he couldn't play essentially half of the games in the stadium, not to mention other games where similar mandates are in effect, like in California, other teams in New York, the Knicks. But so because he was going to miss much of the season, the Nets decided to get rid of him. They didn't want to deal with that controversy. They wanted to be able to practice as a full team without any of these sort of distractions, essentially. So they cut him. I mean, not cut. He's still on the salary. He'll be back whenever this mandate's lifted, when things resume to normalcy. But he's made it clear he's not getting vaccinated. They've made it clear they're not budging. So he's out for the season. And that was a big news item a few months ago. Much more recently, Aaron Rodgers, who's perhaps an even more famous figure in his sport, which is the NFL, American football, U.S. football, said he was immunized and led everyone to believe he'd been vaccinated for much of the season, attending these press scrums in close quarters with many reporters under the premise that he didn't have a mask on because we all assumed vaccinated. But it turns out when he said he was immunized, it meant that he was on some Joe Rogan kick, of taking ivermectin and whatever it was that he'd been advised, not by doctors, but by Joe Rogan and friends. This is what he revealed on the Pat McAfee Show, a podcast and kind of YouTube show online. And so, yeah, that hit the news cycle. He had to miss a week because he caught coronavirus. So he was not just theoretically putting people in danger by letting them think he was vaccinated and less contagious and all that, but in fact, he caught COVID. And so he was probably contagious for a time and putting people in the media at risk. So his case should have been scrutinized much further than Kyrie Irving's. There was much more duplicitousness, much more lying outright, but it wasn't. And so with Matthew Miranda from, like I said, the Jacobin sports podcast, from the Strickland, from Posting and Toasting, from a number of places, fiction writing contests and the like. I have with me the fantastic Matthew Miranda to discuss this very issue, the sort of coverage of these two athletes and their unorthodox approach to the vaccine, and then the difference in their coverage and kind of what it says about the sports world at large. So yeah, without any further ado, I present to you Matthew Miranda. So with me today, and I'm very fortunate to have this gentleman with me as my first guest on the podcast. a legend on multiple fronts, especially for me personally as a Knicks fan. And unprofessionally, I'm wearing a Knicks jersey on, on air. But I had to do
Looks
it.
good. It looks good, man.
It's the night of a huge W, huge one, getting out of a slump. B, it's the day that this City Edition came out, and I'm super proud that I got it. Thanks. Shouts to my wife and daughter. And C, because I have with me one of the founding fathers of the Strickland, which is the place to be if you're a Knicks fan online, the meta mecca. The mecca's already claimed for us Knicks fans, but it's a mecca of sorts. The best place to get information about the Knicks, match reports, analysis after games, like off season. It's you guys are going. Matt, thank you for coming on the podcast. But I guess more importantly, before I even do this, I should mention probably your more relevant credentials, which is you're also a major part of the Jacobin sports podcast. I guess quickly, let's do that. Let's say a couple words about your podcast for people who don't know about it.
So there's two podcasts now, because I'm actually just joined. Stacey Patton, who's also from the Strickland, will be doing a Knicks podcast for the Believe podcast network. So that will be starting in the next week or two. As far as Jacobin goes, we have been running the Jacobin Sports Show since January. So it started this year. It was the brainchild of Bhaskar Sankara, who's the editor of the Jacobin magazine and creator of it. It was basically an opportunity to do a couple things in a sports podcast. It's very important to us that we love sports, we enjoy sports, we want to have fun with sports, but also, if you remember years ago on ESPN, there was a show called Outside the Lines that Bob Lee hosted, and Outside the Lines was ESPN's kind of their serious, almost like a 60 minutes of a sports show where you could talk about the Athletic, but there's so much social significance, political significance, and so many reflections of things in our society that are easier to make apparent through sports, or to discuss in a way that doesn't happen in politics or other arenas. So we decided to make a show about that. I think sports media has definitely become more left-wing over the last 20 years, 15, 20 years, but maybe especially the last 5-10 years. But there's still, I live in an area where sports radio is all, national syndicated hosts, and they're very right-leaning. They're very old world in terms of, the perspective that almost like the athletes are property of if not the fans, then certainly the owners. And we just wanted to bring, let's be intelligent about sports, and let's have fun and have the kind of conversations we'd like to have. And we've been able to have really good luck with guests. We've had Chris Herring on, who covers the NBA now for Sports Illustrated. We've had Dan Devine from The Ringer and Haley O'Shaughnessy. But we've also had, people no one's heard of who have interesting, one of our best guests ever. We had a few months ago on Sydney Umeri, who has written about the NBA and women's college basketball for SB Nation. And just to say, the show has been really fun in terms of you get to ask some people things you've always wanted to ask, but also you get to have guests on about topics that you never would have learned about or gotten that door opened in your mind if you didn't have a chance to listen to this person. So we like to have names that people have heard of, but we'll have, I'm going to have a friend of mine on to talk about hockey just because she knows a shit ton about hockey.
That's cool.
And you want to democratize, in the best way. The best thing that you can get from this media is to try to democratize shit and to try to get voices involved that we all know that there's people on TV that are not as interesting talking about sports as your friend is. But exactly. If that person's father was a play-by-play announcer and your friend's father was a first-generation immigrant who didn't have the credentials in this country. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
exactly. Yeah. No, exactly.
So-
It's all what's the word I'm looking for? Where it's like inherited rather than earned.
yeah, it's not a meritocracy, and you want to
It's not a meritocracy. That's right. Yeah. It's funny, like the internet, generally speaking, is something that I've been pessimistic about over the years. Like back in the day, I was like, it's gonna, democratize everything, and we're all gonna like be making art and writing and sharing ideas. And then like, the Nazis showed up again somehow,
Yeah.
But
I mean,
like,
I don't know how much political democracy works, but I like sports democracy, or at least,
and that's what I was gonna say. No, that's what's so nice is that you see kind of what you'd hope for with the internet actually happening in sports media
Yeah.
and that it is actually democratizing. And like growing up, it was such a almost a far right layer of journalism, right?
Absolutely.
The talk shows were all laced with racism and sexism and kind of just not really like you can't even really imagine being a parent these days and wanting your kid to be in the car while you listen to it, right? Like
Nope.
But so there has been progress, and I think a lot of that has been spurned by the sort of voices that the internet has given some credo to, right? So no, I like that a lot, and so yeah, folks, check out this fella's podcast over here, and obviously I'll put all the info in the in the podcast info ourselves. But so now we have to talk about our topic here, and so on this podcast, I like to focus on news stories are not talked about so much. So this is a little different, but it's more for folks who aren't in the United States, who aren't really aware of where these voices of sort of anti-vax sentiment are coming from, and how people of that profile could be a part of all that. So yeah, I hand you the mic.
So there's similarities and differences between Irving's situation and Roger's situation, and one of the important differences, I think, in how those stories have been laid out stems from the fact that first, when you look at who the stories are about and who is following the stories, the NBA has historically had a tricky history between a predominantly white fan base and a predominantly Black workforce. And I think that is, you don't destroy energy, you don't create energy, it evolves. So it may not look like it did 30 years ago, but like that shit is always still there. And Kyrie being an unusually political athlete at a time when, everyone has the social media polish and juice to make anything they do almost sound like it's political when it's bullshit. But Irving is legitimately has taken unpopular stands. And that puts him in the crosshairs kind of to begin with. I would also say that because I think the NBA fan base is more diverse now than it ever has been, and because people, I think, care more, I think the emerging fan base tends to care more about players than teams. Kyrie is this perfectly polarizing figure because and that's why. So what's fascinating is Kyrie is exactly the type of basketball player who the right has like demonized for
villainized
decades. And yet the irony of everything in this crazy world now is that Irving doesn't want to get a vaccine. His reasons have kind of vacillated. One that's politically interesting is that there was some initial talk that Irving didn't want to get the vaccine because he believes in this idea that is out there for some people that the vaccine is a satanic plot to put microchips inside of Black men, like specifically. So what's fascinating to me is that is not the type of athlete narrative that the right wing, like if you feel that way, like I don't trust any of the government. But that's clearly an indictment of like the government completely. Like if you legitimately think they are using this as an opportunity to do this nefarious, like that's fucked up. That's an indictment of everybody. Yeah. But Irving So then Irving's logic kind of, or at least his reasoning shifted a bit when he went on Instagram Live and said that he was refusing to play. He was refusing to get the vaccine and therefore be able to play because he's advocating for people who have lost their jobs for the same reason. People who've lost their jobs because they won't get vaccinated, which instantly made him a Twitter hero to Ted Cruz and many of that ilk. And like, to have lived long enough to see in the span of probably a month at most, Kyrie Irving going from voicing this wild sounding conspiracy theory that is really a shot at the public's legitimate, complete distrust of the government. And to have that immediately twisted into Ted Cruz tweeting that he stands with Kyrie Irving. And here's your other hilarious Ted Cruz, Kyrie Irving ironic connection. Kyrie, and Aaron Rodgers does this too, and we'll talk about his ass. But both of them have talked about this pro-choice, like, this is my body, bodily autonomy is everything. When Ted Cruz's state, led a lot by Ted Cruz, decided, you know what, we're going to make abortion illegal. Like, we're going to do it. Here it comes. Not only are we going to do it, we're going to do it in a way that incentivizes citizens to spy on, narc on each other. Like, we're not just going to change the law, we're going to like really try to change the society and in terms of what's legitimate and what isn't. And I've struck by this with Rodgers and with Kyrie. The NBA has 3 teams in the state of Texas. I think the NFL has 2. I think 2. Not a word from any athlete that I saw. No, let me correct that. Not a word from any male athlete that I am aware of that when Texas passed the anti-abortion law, no one said a word about body autonomy. No one talked about boycotting games in the state of Texas. None of that came up. We're going to get to Aaron Rodgers too, trust me. But none of that came up. So there's this. So Kyrie is using this kind of this really politics of, you know, the self above all. Like, the personal is not just political. The personal, like, is everything. When I am inconvenienced by anything, that's what Kyrie is doing. But to Kyrie's singular credit, Kyrie has not hidden this at any point. He has been honest about it. He has taken first the hit of looking to lose half his salary because he couldn't play at home. Now he's getting paid for half the salary, but he's not allowed to play until he gets vaccinated. So the team told him, stay away for good. Kyrie has been kind of off of our radar now for a couple of weeks, but he's been honest from the start, if not clear. He has been honest from the start. I am not getting vaccinated. Aaron Rodgers has lied from the summer when Rodgers was asked by reporters, are you vaccinated? And he said, yes, I am immunized. And nobody knew that meant that Aaron Rodgers was on like the Joe Rogan medical plan. And Aaron Rodgers for months,
ayahuasca and ivermectin.
Yeah, I mean, you have a good time if you survive it.
Yeah, maybe.
Aaron Rodgers lied, and it's consequential. Not just like, we can all on a human level understand that, like, look, I don't want to get shit for my belief. You don't need to know it. Like, I'm just gonna, like, I can respect the lie in that sense, but for Rodgers, then the NFL has different standards of rules and different policies right now for how unvaccinated players interact with the media and have certain other privileges or not privileges based on their vaccination status. So Aaron Rodgers has been carrying on enjoying the liberties that vaccinated players have and unvaccinated players don't have, and he's been lying about it the whole time. And then, as is always the case, not only is just the lie itself a big deal, but then the liar compounds it by, in Rodgers' case, going into this bizarre, allocution of
misinformation.
I understand some people may have I may have misled some people, and if you feel I did, then I'm sorry. Like this non-apology apology.
Right.
So the biggest difference between Rodgers and Kyrie, I think, has been, at least in terms of their narrative, is that Kyrie has been nothing but honest, though not clear. And I think Rodgers has been nothing but deceptive and not clear.
Yeah. That's a good summation, I would say, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, I guess underlying all of that, and the difference, obviously, sort of institutionally versus how they were treated, is relative to which state one of them plays in versus the other. So that's not necessarily like a one league punished, the other one didn't, or really, like, neither league really was too assertive in that sense. It was the city of New York, but I would still sort of Kyrie Irving was under so much scrutiny, and has, there's been so much talk of him like hurting his teammates, putting them in danger, and not sacrificing for this. Like, and I haven't heard a lot of that with the Aaron Rodgers stuff. He came back this week, and like I heard them talking about how he claimed he felt misty. I don't even really know what that means, but
I saw that.
Yeah, what like, how do you account for that? I mean, obviously, like, the knee-jerk response is like racism, right? Like, that's probably what underlies most of this stuff. But like, could you dig a little deeper into that? Do you think is there more to it?
I mean, I think the racist part of it is significant. Like, when we said earlier, you can't, racism doesn't go away, it evolves, and the conversations that give you those tells evolve. And Aaron Rodgers, like, he has that privilege, and again, I think in part because of his skin color, because he has up till now only really existed, like, class matters too, and Aaron Rodgers is in the class that pitches lifestyles to people, and that is a very elite, protected class. Kyrie doesn't sell shit like Aaron Rodgers does. Kyrie could, if you took, I would say, top 5 personalities, not skill, but combination of like great players with marketable personality. Aaron Rodgers is top 5 NFL. And just in terms of needle moving personality, whether it's game or words and actions, Kyrie Irving is top 5 NBA.
I mean, I don't know if you remember, sorry to interrupt, but Kyrie had that sort of ad campaign briefly where he was the grandpa. Remember, he would show up on the court as a grandpa,
Uncle Drew.
Like, ball. Yeah.
Drew,
but that faded out, and I think as he became more politically minded, I think he probably had it like that's probably a stance he's taken, right, against commercialization, whatever. I mean, and it's funny, like my personal trajectory with Kyrie Irving went from like the flat earth stuff. I was skeptical. I thought maybe he was playing some sort of like like situationalist game with the media or something, where he was just catching them off guard or whatever. But then slowly, like, I remember being floored. I'm not a fan of the Brooklyn Nets. I don't want to support anything about them. I don't like how they sort of hijacked that summer's plan and all that stuff. But I remember seeing him go straight to Tahani Abushi, post a huge playoff win for them, I think, and shaking her hand and being floored myself, like, wow, that's my candidate who very few people are really getting behind. And so suddenly, like, his politics started to come into, bigger frame. And I was like, wow, this guy might be up to more than meets the eye, right? He's not just some sort of a joker, but obviously, I'm not a big fan of this whole vaccine thing. I mean, anytime you're doing something like for the workers, for the working class, like, I want to get behind that. And so I think, like, the philosophy behind it is there's nothing inherently wrong with. I would argue. I would suggest maybe that, like, there's a better way to go about this than like not playing basketball. But
I think there is a flaw there that is significant, and I think something really early in our conversation, like, it reminded me of that too. Like, so, like, okay, again, there's that irony, like how we're in such a strange moment in our reality that Kyrie Irving and Ted Cruz can somehow intersect. Like, and so along those lines, Kyrie, I think class matters a lot, and I think no matter how well-intentioned Kyrie Irving's sensibilities may be, how to say this, like, there's something very ironic about Kyrie Irving saying that he's doing this to support workers, because, and I was thinking about this early on, like when you mentioned, like, we're talking about two athletes who are in the spotlight anti this vaccine, when, like, as most data shows, about 90% of athletes are reportedly vaccinated.
That's
so
important. Yeah.
And there's this, and this is, so there's something interesting to me about this, and certainly it goes back to 2016 at least. Donald Trump lost 2 elections. There is always, while he was in office, since he lost, since then, the Times especially has like a whole section now every day devoted to what a Trump voter thinks about something that 80% of the country is like fine with or whatever.
Yeah.
There's this sudden, really strange impulse, and it's not an accident in this country, and it's not an accident that it's happening, particularly with this isn't about race, but about class and about wealth and about, living in a time when the real capital G, capital word Gilded Age, like, is happening. And you're seeing more and more, going back to WTO protests in the late 90s, and then Occupy, stuff 10 years later, and all this other shit, and Bernie Sanders' rise over the last couple of elections. You're seeing, like, class shit is coming, and COVID has just made it even more exacerbated. The richer are getting even more fabulously richer, and other people can't function. Things are worse than they've ever been. And when you have a Kyrie Irving saying, I'm doing this for the workers, you're not. And the reason you're not is because you are of the class where it's just endemic to you being a part. Like, Kyrie Irving sells shoes. He's not just, and whatever you think of that, the point is he's doing it. Exactly. He does sell shit. He is in the top whatever percent of the public. So what's really going on is, because guess what? Most of the working class got vaccinated voluntarily. A lot of the people who have died are working class, are specifically communities of color, are specifically communities of lower income, are specifically all the people that it always sounds good to stand up for. And now you're in a circumstance where you're standing up for people who reflect your own privilege, because Kyrie Irving, and this is not a judgment, this is just a reality, this is just truth. Kyrie Irving can afford to lose a year of his income more than most people. Exactly. And in fact, given that he's not losing all of it, Kyrie Irving losing half of his income is better than 99% of the population getting all of their income. So again, there's this strange political reflection in sports. It's easier to see it in sports. Why is there so much attention? I mean, there is something significant to it. There's a reason, we tell each other stories because it matters, and this story clearly matters. I don't know the full range of why do we care so much about what the minority thinks now, given that for centuries, that same minority, and I don't think it's any more complicated than self-interest, has legally and illegally done whatever they can to not regard the viewpoints of the minority at all.
On the flip side of everything. Exactly. No, and so that's like what you're sort of like skirting around, and I think we might as well just dive into this fact too, is that if you're truly looking out for the working class and a working class that has increasingly fallen prey to misinformation, specifically about this vaccine, you could very easily make the argument that the best thing for the working class is that mandate, because you've seen like numbers of people getting vaccinated skyrocket since the mandate was put into effect, because people were kind of on the bubble. I don't have the vaccine. And there's so much of it is like, because I don't have it, I don't want to go through that process, I'm going to come up with a logic and I'm going to find the research I want to not get it. And then suddenly it's like, do you really want to go down that path? Like, here's the thing. You're not going to be able to go to work tomorrow, right? They got the vaccine. And so, I mean, New York City public workers, I think it was like 67%, jumped up to like 89% in 1 week because of the mandate.
Yeah.
Like it or not, that's very effective. And again, when you look at the numbers and the science and all of that, you can certainly make the argument that that was for the benefit of the working class. So for Kyrie Irving to not recognize that aspect of it, and maybe putting the working class in danger by feeding into the narrative that there's this sort of legitimate other side, that's unfortunate. But now let's kind of quickly shuffle to Aaron Rodgers, because as bad as everything we've said about Kyrie there, I think Aaron Rodgers comes out way worse, or should. And the problem here is that he hasn't, right? And the media, perhaps it's also an effect of it being like the second case. And so a lot of the fervor has died down. But on the other hand, his kind of crimes are way worse, as far as the fact that he lied to people. He put people in danger in those media scrums by sort of letting them think he was vaccinated. And then he ended up having COVID. And I'm sure he was a part of, because of that sort of period where you're contagious before you're showing symptoms. I'm sure he put people in real harm's way. So, I mean, beyond the fact that, we've kind of highlighted what's kind of why that the disparity in coverage is there, like, what more can we do, as sports fans, as media consumers? Like, how do we hold someone like Aaron Rodgers to account when the mainstream media is maybe kind of choosing not to?
Well, we don't need to, because Aaron Rodgers said on the Pat McAfee show that he took full responsibility. So,
okay,
it's all taken care of.
We'll take his word for it. Yeah,
yeah. I think what there was a scene once in The Walking Dead where it's many years ago, so I'm not spoiling this for anybody.
No,
there's a scene where at the end of one episode, the character of Glenn, if you know Glenn was like very beloved, and Glenn basically is trapped under a dumpster. He's under a dumpster, and there are like 100 zombies around the dumpster, and there's no people, and he's stuck under the dumpster, and like as he's under it, you see zombies like, they found him down there, and like you're upset because there's no way that this character is going to survive, and then the next episode comes along, and I can't remember how they did it, but like Glenn was suddenly like safe and out of it, and it was like really cheap, like it was super cheap and unearned. And I remember complaining to a friend of mine, and we're like kind of going back and forth, and then at one point it hit me that like, I'm watching a show about a zombie apocalypse. Like, why am I hung up on this thing not being like all the way authentic? Right. So I think the NFL does that kind of shit, like in a similar sense, where like, and it's why the Rodgers story doesn't faze the NFL. Like, right. Think of everything that you accept ethically from the NFL. Where does this rank?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great. See, I think that's probably where we leave it. I think
it's always good to leave it with the undead. Always good.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah. And plus, that basketball's better than football. Sorry, just it's out there. It's science now.
It's science.
Well, and to answer my own question, as far as like what you can do as a sports fan, I'm gonna speak for this humble gentleman over here. Find your local. You don't have to just read ESPN or consume the posts. The back page of the post. Find the guys like these folks over at the Strickland. Find people who are committed to reporting on their favorite teams. The kind of the old school way, right? Like, just pull up your sleeves and you guys are just diving in and covering every aspect of it. Fan support all around, like fans of the team coming together. I mean, I think that's kind of an answer for what we can do is find alternative streams of information and support the little guy, right?
There's never been a better time if you are a fan who enjoys, just reading about your team. There's never been more good writing about your team out there than there is right now.
Yeah. That's the perfect place to leave off, I suppose. Except perhaps, let's go Knicks.
It does look nice. It does look nice.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you so much for coming on. Quickly plug yourself. Where do people find you? I mean, obviously I'll put your info, but you might as well, and like any project you're working on.
Yeah, so I am writing right now at Posting and Toasting about the Knicks. I also write about them at the Strickland, which is the strict.land. I write features for Jacobin, sometimes the magazine or the website, and Jacobin Sports. You can find us at Jacobin Sports on Twitter. We have pages on Spotify, on Apple. Check out the pod. Projects I'm working on. Yes, right now at Posting, we are running a most loved Nick ever tournament with an asterisk next to the word ever because they don't pay me enough to do all time. So I went back to one of the 80s.
I loved it. That was a great exercise, especially for those of us who are, old enough to have seen some of those folks. I loved. Even I remember voting against Xavier McDaniel, I think, and feeling kind of bad.
That was the closest one. Him and Mitch were 50-50. Like,
yeah,
the 90s Knicks did very well.
I went for Mitch just because, we got to resign that dude. But anyway, sorry, we're way off topic here. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank you for having me, man. I had a lot of fun.
Fantastic stuff from Matthew Miranda. It was so hard to edit that down. And so, yeah, like I said, you can find the full interview on if you subscribe to my Patreon, you'll get access to that in a special longer format interview. It's just the interview, very little of my sort of intro outro stuff. But yeah, find that there. But yeah, I think I caught the most relevant parts for our conversation here, and it was just an honor to have Matthew on my podcast as my very first guest, no less. And I look forward to more interviews in the future with him. And of course, in my next episode, I'll have another great guest as well. Anyway, let's move on. Keep it going. We're going to move to Central and South America, a little bit of North America, in fact, this time, although the Spanish-speaking parts of it. So first of all, we're going to talk about in the vein of sports, since we were just with a sort of sports journalist celebrity of sorts, we're going to talk about a bit of a tragedy. For anyone who knows about football or soccer, a legend of the sport, vis-a-vis Sergio Aguero, who made his name with Manchester City, has recently been purchased by Barcelona and was set to be a star there, has come down with a really major knee injury, and it's looking like his career might be finished, is the latest news. And you might be wondering why that's news here. Because it is a significant cultural thing. He's a legendary, maybe top 10 striker in history, striker being the attacking position, the players who score goals. It's a legendary figure whose career has been cut short by an injury that's just tragic. If you don't understand the significance of the sport in Argentina, and really in Europe, because he's made his career in Europe for club football, you can see this video here where you see fans just backed up for miles to get tickets for this is in San Jose, and they're trying to get tickets for an Argentina versus Brazil football game to qualify for the World Cup. Just crazy scenes, just to show you the significance of the sport there, and why for me this is newsworthy, that sort of legend in Argentina and the football world at large. His career might be over, and of course he's striking a more hopeful tone, but that's the latest. And from there, we'll move to some slightly better news out of Mexico, and to sort of give us a little culture along with our sports and politics and economics this week. A painting called Diego y Yo by Frida Kahlo, my daughter's favorite painter, has just broken the record as the largest grossing painting by a Central South American artist. Her painting sold at Sotheby's auction house here in New York City for $39.4 million. So, although she's passed, shouts to Frida Kahlo, still making news. And yeah, her paintings are beautiful. It's a great painting. You can see it here. Just great. Now, moving swiftly along, this is a long episode, to Europe quickly. As I promised, we're not going to skip continents, except for Oceania. Sorry, folks. You guys, we'll deal with you guys eventually, I promise. Now, in something that could go in the sort of weird of the week, a border crisis has broken out on the border between Belarus and Poland, which is in fact the border between Belarus and the EU. I don't want to speculate much. I'm going to have a guest on next week from Poland who's going to give me more of a local perspective on what's happening there. But what's happening on the superficial side is apparently Belarus is ramming the border intentionally with immigrants with the intention of creating a crisis for political reasons. I'll get into it next week with the guest from Poland who's going to give us more information on it. But if you don't believe the news that Belarus would possibly be doing this, I guess the news item for this week is apparently Dubai has prevented, they're now not allowing Iraqis to fly to Belarus, which would, I suppose, back the claim of Poles and the EU that Belarus is creating this crisis. So that's a wild story coming out of Europe. And we're going to get more out of locals next week to tell us more about that, because I think that sounds important. Finally, and my last news item of the week, I've got a great guest, Yasin, and you can find his Twitter right there, is here to tell us about the German elections and what's happening with the parties there and the sort of eternal struggle between left and right, and how the COVID crisis and global politics and all that have impacted things locally in Germany. So yeah, thank you, Yasin. Without further ado, let's hear what the man has to say.
I will quickly present what each of the 6 parties stand for. The Left Party is the most left-wing party in Germany. Some positions of the party are, for example, cutting taxes for lower and middle classes and increasing taxes for the rich via a special tax for high incomes, a ban on all arms dealers and foreign intervention in general, a legalization of all drugs, similar to how it was handled in Portugal, and a improved benefits system, which would undo the often criticized social reforms of the mid-2000s. The Left Party in Germany is a general pool of all sorts of different left-wing thought. You have everything ranging from social democrats, who for many different reasons aren't a part of the Social Democratic Party, to Marxist-Leninists. You have a very wide range of different leftist thought within the party. But I would say generally the party is a social democratic one with slightly more radical leanings than a current-day social democratic party would have. The Social Democratic Party of Germany is one of the traditional 2 big parties and the oldest party currently sitting in parliament. Some of the proposals made by the SPD include to make Germany CO2 neutral by 2045, to improve digital as well as public transporting infrastructure, a rise of the minimum wage from now €9.50 to €12 an hour, as well as a universal public health insurance, which would include people who are currently excluded from our public insurance. The SPD is very comparable to a party like the Labour Party in Great Britain and other various social democratic parties all around Europe. The Green Party is a eco-liberal, socially progressive party, so they have a lot of green proposals, but they're not necessarily critical of capitalism, instead trying to reach a solution to our current climate crisis within the system. Some of their proposals include a complete phase-out of coal energy by the year 2030, a higher minimum wage of 12 euros an hour, so the same as the SPD, rent control, and a new law for better treatment of transgender people. The Green Party enjoys a lot of popularity amongst younger people because of their image as being a green-friendly party. Next up, we have the FDP, the Free Democratic Party, which is our liberal party, although in Germany, what we call liberalism would be closer to what Americans would call libertarianism, although not quite as extreme as, for example, American libertarians are. But they also follow the libertarian mantras of small government, low taxes, deregulation, privatization, and a constant will to find solutions within private institutions instead of state solutions. The idea that the best ideas will find a way in the free market. Something that German liberals love is the classic image of America as a place where everyone can have a successful company in their garage. The traditional American dream, which will probably be well known to our American listeners. A good reason why the liberals are so successful currently after having a long time where they weren't quite as successful is their current leader, Christian Lindner, who is very popular with Germans because he's very charismatic and a good talker. Even I, as someone who rarely agrees with him, will concede that he's very good at making his arguments. Next up, I'm going to talk about the traditionally biggest party in Germany, which actually consists of two parties, because one is the Christian Democratic Union, which is in 15 of the 16 states in Germany, and the Christian Social Union, which is only in Bavaria. So Bavaria essentially has its own party at state level, which can often lead to Bavaria having an extra presence in the national discourse. But both parties usually tend to work together as one. And they're also in parliament one faction as the Union. The CDU, CSU, or as I'm going to call them, the Union, because it's easier to say, tended to be a big tent party for the last 16 years under Angela Merkel. Very moderate socially, not quite as Christian or conservative, whilst economically being very much neoliberal, very concerned about not creating any new debt, keeping inflation low, helping various industries, such as the auto industry, which is very important in Germany as an employer. The Union, especially under Angela Merkel, tended to be very much reactive to the situation and not proactive, not really looking into setting impulses and making new policy as much as just trying to make policy on the back foot depending on what was needed. But now that Angela Merkel has stepped down, I'd expect the CDU to become a lot more conservative, similar to the Bavarian-only CSU, which is already more conservative than its statewide sister party. General things that the CDU-CSU wants is more government surveillance online for safety reasons, not create any debt. They are against legalizing marijuana. They are for Europe generally, and pretty much for the status quo, all in all. Now last, and certainly least, the most controversial and the youngest party in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, short AfD, a party which was founded in 2013 as a slightly to the right of the Union party that is anti-Euro and wanted to bring back the German mark, which was the currency before the euro. Since then, the party has majorly slid to the right, where it now can be considered pretty fascistic, all in all, especially in East Germany, where, due to the economic catastrophe that has happened in East Germany, which is far too complicated to talk about now, but that has, as an effect, driven a lot of people out of the region and a lot of Nazis into the region, so East Germany tends to vote a lot more extreme than the West would. Some of the proposed policy of the AfD include defunding the public media, all in all, and privatizing it, prioritizing STEM fields over social sciences. They want strict immigration control and a ban on all refugees, with strict border walls, with guards, etc. General skepsis towards fighting climate change or the current COVID-19 pandemic. They are anti-vax, for example, and generally they are very Trumpian outside of the economic populism, because in terms of the economic policy they are very, very much pro-market, etc. But as dangerous as their policies are, their rhetoric is probably currently just as dangerous, with constant provocations towards the far right, always causing a lot of heated debate surrounding the party. For example, a former leader of the party contemplated having asylum seekers shot at the border if necessary. There were posters with smiling children with the caption "Islam Free Schools." There was also a poster with a pig that said "Islam is not compatible with the German cuisine." Stuff like that. The AfD tends to be pushing the envelope when it comes to being absolutely horrible. So after presenting all of the major parties, let me quickly talk about the events that have led to the current result. At the start of the year, the Conservatives were having a huge lead of roughly 10% over the Greens, with the Social Democrats in a distant third, and then the other three parties around 10%. Then something happened with the Left Party. As it often happens, there was another rift within the party, which would be one of many reasons why the Left Party would drop significantly before the election. The Union then made the biggest possible mistake they could have done. Instead of appointing a popular Bavarian Prime Minister, Markus Söder, who is also the leader of the CSU, they instead appointed CDU leader Armin Laschet, who has had a long-standing career within the party, but was clearly unfit to be the chancellor candidate as he lacked charisma and general competence. One of his biggest scandals included laughing during a massive drought disaster, which it probably wasn't because of the drought disaster, but it just generally looked very bad on him. But yeah, his biggest problem was that he lacked composure and he lacked any charisma. Even conservative voters who generally would vote for anything really weren't really taking to Armin Laschet, which was one of the bigger reasons why the party lost massively after Merkel's departure, which the Greens should have capitalized on as the second party, right? They couldn't capitalize on it either, as they appointed a fairly unexperienced Annalena Baerbock as a chancellor candidate who wasn't really well known outside of her own party, and had various minor scandals. A lot of them were hyped up by the right-wing media in Germany, especially by the biggest newspaper in Germany, which is very right-wing. So her negative reputation deflected badly on her party. So the party that could actually capitalize on the two bigger parties falling behind in the polls were the Social Democrats, who went from 15% at the start of the year, distant third, to getting over 20% and being the frontrunners, which was a genuine shock for most people. They had former mayor of Hamburg and finance minister Olaf Scholz as the main candidate, who, while lacking charisma, had a lot of perceived competence and had, similar to Joe Biden during the last US presidential election, a sort of comparative good look compared to the other candidates in the race. So September approached, and the results read as followed. The SPD won the most percent with over 25. The CDU had just over 24, which was the worst result for them in their history since 1945. The Greens had a very disappointing 14.8%, considering there were as high up as 22% in some polls early in the year. The FDP had a very respectable 11.5%. Again, their campaign mostly consisted around black and white photographs of their leader, Christian Lindner, with phrases like, "Let's make Germany the economy number one in the world." So basic platitudes with a personality seemed to be working for them. The AfD had 10.3%. They massively lost in West Germany compared to the last election, and 2% overall, but they massively won in East Germany, for especially in a German state called Sachsen, where they had almost 25% of the vote, which is a lot for a party which isn't the SPD or the CDU. So they are seemingly consolidating in the East, which is a massive issue because while the West German AfD is a very far-right party, the East German AfD are really Nazi-like. They're very fascist. So, and they seem to be sticking around for quite some time. The left absolutely fell during this election. They halved their percentage of votes to 4.9%, which would have been catastrophic because in Germany we have a 5% minimum threshold to even enter parliament, unless you get 3 candidates directly voted in, which is the only reason why the left party is even in parliament at all. So it was an absolute catastrophe for left-wing politics in Germany, this election. So we're roughly 2 months after the election. The most obvious current coalition seems to be one of Social Democrats, Green Party, and the Liberals, with it seeming clear that the Greens and the Social Democrats are very lenient towards the Liberal Party to make the government coalition happen, which would probably mean that not much would change compared to the current government of Conservatives and Social Democrats. So anyways, this was my way too long ramble about the German elections. Hopefully you got a little bit of an insight into German politics, and if I want to and Sinan wants to, I can make something else happen in a future episode of this little podcast. Bye for now.
Excellent stuff. Thank you very much, Yasin. Again, this is how you'll find him. Very informative. Thank you for telling us about that, and I hope you'll be back to give us more news on Germany whenever that time may arrive. Our official late-stage correspondent, Yasin. Anyway, moving on finally to my power ranking segment, the corporate media, the U.S. corporate media, top talking points of the week. Boy, I've made this a tongue twister. Coming in at number 5, dropping from 2 last week, is Joe Biden's infrastructure plan, and it passed, right? And there's talk of the Build Back Better plan hopefully being passed before Christmas. Although, like I mentioned in the last podcast, one should not expect that to be passed briskly. And so yeah, but that's still in the news. There's still talk about it, I guess, because the infrastructure bill passed, it has maintained its position in the news cycle. Number 4 is CRT, critical race theory. And last week it was number 2, much higher because of the elections and how it supposedly impacted the race in Virginia and New Jersey. This week, the news story has flipped and the right has flipped and gone insane. They have started talking about banning and burning books. For a change, the media is absolutely right to be focused on this. This is a crazy cultural moment in the United States. The right has gone... Once there's talk of book burning, I think we can start to be concerned about autocratic tendencies in the right. And sure enough, that moment has arrived. Number 3 this week is the courts and racism. Kyle Rittenhouse, the man who drove across state borders with guns to somehow be involved with his guns in the riots taking place during the summer of discontent, all the riots regarding police violence and protests. He notoriously went there, killed 3 people, and looks to be getting off. And so, yeah, that's obviously gotten a lot of attention in the news for good reason. Additionally, we have Ahmed Arbery, who was just gunned down in the streets. And if you don't know why this might be important or relevant, race in this country is not resolved. Racism is not a resolved thing. And if you don't believe me, here are a few examples of people involved with these 2 cases I've mentioned talking about race in a slightly antiquated way. On the one hand, we have the judge in the case against Kyle Rittenhouse.
And when the clerk, the government official, drew the name out of the tumbler, it was a black, the only black. There was nothing wrong with it. It was all okay. But what do they talk about? Optics nowadays? Is that the word for things? That was a bad optic, I thought.
And in another case, we have the lawyer coming again, the prosecution, or no, rather, I guess the defense in the Ahmaud Arbery case, who are defending the murderers, two white men in Georgia who murdered Ahmaud Arbery in cold blood. Here's how he's referring to black folks in 2021.
Over 100. And the idea that we're going to be serially bringing these people in to sit with the victim's family one after another, obviously there's only so many pastors they can have. And if their pastor's Al Sharpton right now, that's fine, but then that's it. We don't want any more black pastors coming in here, or other Jesse Jackson, whoever was in here earlier this week, sitting with the victim's family, trying to influence a jury in this case. And I'm not saying the state is even aware that Mr. Sharpton was in the courtroom. I certainly wasn't aware of it till last night. But I think the court can understand my concern about bringing people in who really don't have any ties to this case other than political interests.
So yeah, race is not resolved, and the media is also, in this case, rightfully focusing on some real sort of cultural touchstones, like real friction points in our culture here. Terrible stuff. Finally, number 2 is inflation, and that's just broke into the news cycle. It didn't make my my power rankings last episode. So yeah, inflation is happening, but there's been very little talk of the Saudi Arabia story, which I mentioned. So I don't know why, but that's happening. But so yeah, inflation has taken the number 2 place in our national discourse in the news. And then finally, Trump, number 1 this week. And again, actually, for good reason, perhaps. Last week he was number 3, so he's moved up in the power rankings. But this week, it's regarding his buddy, Stephen Bannon, who has been indicted. He's going to serve time, potentially. He has to show up in court and spill the beans. So we'll see how that goes. Supposedly, the judge on the case was a Trump appointee, so nobody should ever hope for the best in these types of scenarios. If your faith in the United States justice system hasn't been rocked by the cases I already mentioned, vis-a-vis Rittenhouse and Arbery, this one might do it. But yeah, I have a feeling we can't expect Bannon to hit with anything too hard. But yeah, that's it. That's it for our power rankings this week. And that is also it for our episode this week. So stay tuned for more next week. Great guests. Thanks again to Matthew, Miranda, and Yasin, who were fantastic this episode. And yeah, stay tuned for more. Can't wait to see you next week.